Well, good morning, Dawn. Thank you again for taking the time to speak with me today. How are you doing?
Doing okay.
So, with this, first off, just for everyone watching, you just tell people like how long have you lived in LO?
Um, I've lived in Oregon on and off for a while during and after graduate school, but I've lived in Lake Oswego since 1984,
Oh,
which was the last time I moved here. I moved here twice,
so
but since 1984.
and so you say you've moved here twice. Like, where were you living previously in those two instances?
Well, I was in graduate school in upstate New York, and I came out here. Boy, it was the summer of 1978 to do a a research project with the Kaiser Permanente's Center for Health Services Research. And when I got out of graduate school, I could not find a job anywhere in New York. And I ran into the investigators team from the research center at a national public health meeting. And they said, well, would you want to work for us? And I said, yes. So I worked in the research center for about a year and a half. And then that was during the Reagan administration, and the funding for research and public health got chopped. And I wound up getting laid off. So I moved back to upstate New York, Rochester, and worked in a hospital there for almost 3 years, and then came back in '84. So I've been here ever since then.
And did you grow up in upstate New York?
No, I grew up in New York City, in Queens, which on the outskirts of Queens. So yeah, I was there for first 18 years, and then upstate for let's see, about between school and work, about 8 to 9 years in upstate New York before moving here.
I was curious, like how does, especially with well, both upstate, but how does LO compare with Queens?
Well, yeah, I've been thinking about that. You know, when you live in New York City, when I first moved here, I noticed the lack of diversity immediately. It hadn't occurred to me when I was in graduate school. I don't think I was here long enough to experience much of Portland. But when I moved here and I started interacting with folks at work and getting around more, having a car made a big difference. The uniformity was pretty striking. But when, to be honest, when I think about growing up in New York City, it's huge. And there's quite a bit of diversity, but the neighborhoods are pretty uniform and segregated. So I grew up in far eastern Queens, which is what my folks could afford. And we lived in an predominantly Italian Irish neighborhood. So my impression of New York is as waves of immigrants came from Europe, eventually people moved from crowded apartment dwelling in Manhattan, lower Manhattan, upper Manhattan mostly, and then started moving out to the outer boroughs. So at the time we lived in Belrose, it was predominantly Italian and Irish. We're the only Asian family that I could detect in the neighborhood, and I was the only Asian kid other than my brother in elementary school. I guess the other thing I would say is like Oswego is much more affluent than the neighborhood I grew up in, both in terms of its image and reality.
Could you expand on that a little bit when you say in terms of image and reality?
Well, you know, when I moved here and I found an apartment in Lake Oswego, it just happened I was staying with a coworker who lived here, and she gave me a copy of the review and said, here, you know, check out places to live. And I found a really nice place down on 2nd. And now I live up on 9th. Moved very far. But, you know, as you talk about where you live at work, when you say Lake Oswego, the reaction is immediate and very obvious. Oh, you live in Lake Oswego. So Lake Oswego has a reputation. And then
did you know about that? You know, 'cause I hear from a
no.
lot of people that
No.
you know they find out when they say it, and then people react to them.
Yeah, that's how I learned it. And I mean, it was years before I heard Lake No Negro.
Mm-hmm.
I had not heard that, and and then the reality is, if you look at my neighborhood, for example, all of the houses that were here when I moved in, most of them are gone. They've been replaced by much larger and more expensive housing. If I were to if I were to sell my house and try to buy one now, I don't think I could live here. I couldn't afford to live here, housing wise.
And just to sort of getting a little ahead and talking about how the town has kind of evolved and changed since you've been there, but I was curious, you know, you said you hadn't heard about sort of Lake Oswego's reputation. What about, you know, Oregon's history in general, especially with like histories of exclusion laws and the Land Donation Act and all that? Did you know anything about that moving from New York?
No. Oregon and Portland in particular, maybe because some of the folks that I interacted with at the research center. But I had no clue. Of course, I didn't go to school here, so I didn't get a lot of the history of the Oregon Trail or whatever. So no, I would say an awareness of that probably about 10 years ago. And I don't know if you remember, we had Walidah Imarisha, do her presentation at church, and that was a deep learning experience for sure. And there's been more since then, but it was a past I was not aware of. Mhm.
Yeah. I always find that fascinating just because it's a story I hear over and over again. And it's always, like you talked about not, going to schools here, but it's like we didn't learn that in school here either,
Oh, that's
even
true.
then, which is,
Yeah.
it always feels like it's kind of like it's something you learn about almost not necessarily informally, but like you have to be in a space where people are really seeking it out to learn
Mm.
this history that I think it'd be safe to say has had a pretty profound effect on, how Oregon works. But to that end though, getting back to, 84, now we're in, 2022, you just talk about how LO has either changed or stayed the same, especially in terms of like racial dynamics since you moved there for the second time.
Yeah. First of all, I have to say, I'm kind of oblivious about Lake Oswego because I worked in Portland, and a lot of my friendships and certainly work relationships and volunteering and activities, a lot of things were oriented towards Portland. So I wasn't really terribly well clued into, what was going on in city council, or, what was going on in schools. I have no children. So, my awareness of that was pretty limited. Um, and my awareness of Oregon obviously was lacking. And in terms of Portland, I paid attention to city politics, but I would say I was kind of oblivious to a lot of this until I had time to pay attention, or until I took the time, let's say,
Mm.
to pay attention. Um, so, I don't know that I'm a real good judge of how things have changed over, you know, 38 years. But, certainly in the last 5 or so, I've seen some changes, but they're slow in coming and incremental.
Mm.
And I can remember um, some incidents over time. Um, for example, I think it was maybe the early 2000s. There was an incident of anti-Semitism that happened to someone I happened to work with who lived in Lake Oswego. So I was aware of that. And then when I served on church council, um, became aware of incidents that came up at the school, because at the high schools, and then eventually the middle schools. And we wrote letters to the editor. We had some relationships to the schools through various people who were teachers. And so I was aware of it, but and I actually found it quite shocking. Because when I went to high school, I can't remember such blatant acts of racism. In retrospect, I I was subject to what you would call microaggressions,
Mhm.
but blatant acts of racism. Um, that I found that very shocking. Yeah, and it still happens. Um, it's a long story, but in interaction with an artisan whom I met, who had a shop in Oregon City, and he was asking me about the possibilities of what kinds of locations I would suggest in Lake Oswego. He was considering relocating, and he tried one of the newer retail spaces, and he was told, "Oh, you don't want to rent here," and ultimately wound up in Tualatin. Um, but this was just 2019. I mean, it's still there, and probably has always been there. It's just that now it just seems much more obvious and possibly blatant. Um, as far as I can tell. I think there is some progress, some structural progress, but there's still a lot to be done.
Yeah, I mean, it feels like if nothing else, like people are kind of there's more conversations, at least like more public and sort of larger scale conversations about it in recent years than in the past. But to your point
Yeah.
about kind of being more involved in Portland, because again, it's kind of a common thread and something I've definitely, I mean, seen with my own family where it's a like, even if there's not something like I guess like explicitly excluding you from being in like city affairs, local government, all these things where it just feels like a lot of us we don't, as far as like being people of color, we don't really see ourselves out here, even if we live here. And it just kind of like even just like implicitly kind of like shifts us to being involved in other communities. If I guess is that kind of a fair assessment?
Um, I can only speak for myself,
Hmm.
and my father in particular was he worked really hard, and encouraged us to stay below the radar, not to speak out, not to speak up. Um, there's a saying that he had, which I asked my aunt about, and she had never heard it, but I've heard it in other settings, and um, I'll I don't know it exactly, but the phrase is like, "A nail that sticks up will be hammered down." And I think I think he encouraged us, he trained us, and he certainly modeled staying below the radar, not 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 sticking out, not sticking up, as that nail does. Um, and I heard it again in a play. Um, uh, uh, it's gosh, it was I think it was Hirabayashi, and he said that same statement, and then he said, "Well, it depends on how big a nail it is," you know. And I thought, well, what a change in perspective. you're afraid to stick up, but of course, if you're big and strong, what hammer is going to knock you down? So I think for me, the thought of being in public office or being extremely vocal, I'm much more comfortable, I think, behind the scenes and one-on-one and, doing things incrementally, gradually, just kind of wearing down that barrier, eroding it slowly as opposed to hammering at it. So that seems to be, at least at this point, that's what I've arrived at for myself is that impact of that upbringing. Of course, my mother was 180 degrees opposite. She was very outspoken and encouraged us to, speak up for ourselves and defend ourselves. And, if anybody says X, just tell them why. And if that doesn't work, tell me and I'll deal with it. So, and I'm multiracial. My mother was half white, and we grew up in a household where my grandmother was Irish. So, I have a multiracial upbringing and life experience. But the Japanese portion of it certainly is very strong.
You talked about sort of those different approaches and, kind of how at least there's been more conversations in recent years. I think a big part of that has been, LOUCC and, I mean, especially when it comes to like the story with, how Respond to Racism got started. Like, I think, LOUCC is very huge in that. But, can you just talk a little bit about, I always forget like the order of operations with everything, but I believe it was the book group that first got started in, yeah, can you remind me what year you all started with the book group, and did Walidah come after that or before that?
We started up at church. You're talking about we
Mhm.
started up an anti-racist effort. Golly, that probably came first, right after there was an incident at the high school. The one with the as I recall, there were signs, and they were anti-Black and anti-Semitic, and the school response was lukewarm at best, and so we said, well, we need to do something. I think Walidah's presentation grew out of that. And I think that was around 2014, maybe. And then the incident that sparked the formation of Respond to Racism, that was 2017. And my recollection is that Willie and Liberty had coffee, and then they wanted to expand the opportunity for conversation. And two of our church members noted that and and then we started applying to the church council and say, we would like to open the church to this meeting. And they said, sure. So that was not a hard sell at all. Yeah. And I'm not sure which book group you're referring to. We have had book discussions. We've discussed several books, but it was actually a separate group that kind of got started, and we focused on education first, educating ourselves, doing our own work. So I think we've been at it probably at least 13 or 14 years. And I give a lot of credit to Respond for accelerating, I would say, the learning and the urgency of doing more and doing better. Yeah, for sure.
I would definitely just say also, because I think, when you talked earlier about kind of, seeking out or, having kind of more community in Portland and doing more activities in Portland, I think one of the things that kind of has come out of Respond and sort of like these different spaces, and I'd be remiss if I didn't also mention LO for Love and the Baha'i community and LO as well, is that like with the monthly meetings, and I think in very much large part, again, when I look at you, I look at, Jane, Jan, as they're all, I can't name off all the people, I shouldn't start on here, but one of the big things I think especially with the monthly meetings prior to the pandemic, when we could do them in person, that was so huge. It's just like you all, offered to, set up the space, do, just set up food out there, like have like an actual potluck environment, wash dishes, all that, the stuff that kind of goes, it goes under the radar because, it's not the part that's on stage, but it makes all this possible. It makes, it actually, when we talk about building community, like, actually creating a space for us, not just like come to a lecture, just come to a talk, but also, again, have those moments before or during the breaks, afterwards, to talk with each other, have a bite to eat. Some people, it'd be funny, like, not to rant because I'm interviewing you here, but, looking at, especially like having some of the students who would come there and, a big sell is there going to be food? Like, it's really important, but I'm not sure. Would you say, in just in terms of specifically in terms of like the social aspect and the community building aspect, like, is there something else like that, especially where I see, because I can't really think of other places where I see more people of color, especially like interacting in LO beyond sort of like, whether it be the meetings before, now we're doing more like, cultural festivals, and we just had the AAPI Heritage Month Festival, Juneteenth is coming up. Like, where else is there? Can you think of other places where that's really happening consistently in LO?
I think you've named most of the ones I'm aware of, and that social time, boy, really want that back. I appreciate Zoom. I mean, Zoom has made a lot of things possible over the last 2 years, and there's some advantages to it, but that personal interaction is really, there's just something about breaking bread with people that it just relaxes you. It just kind of opens you up. We've actually been having breakfast on Wednesdays at 9, and we're kind of consistently like whoever shows up, come and we'll talk about whatever. And I'm actually thinking of doing the same thing for our social justice group at church. I mean, we've been meeting by Zoom, and it's pretty much business. So, it's pretty serious. It's intense, kind of intense. And it's like, and it's not in person. So you kind of miss cues about how people are doing, unless you're very thoughtful about asking, which some people, which I could be better at. Let's just put it that way. I mean, I'm usually like, let's get on with the agenda. But I think that personal connection is just so important, and opportunities for that are so important. Opportunities for discussion. I'm in a book group through the library, and it was actually Respond that advertised it. And I think the first meeting, Willie was there, and maybe Catherine as well. And anyway, I've been going to that, and but it's largely a white space still. And the books we talk about are to give us a sense of other life experiences than our own. And so we do have some discussions about race and and other aspects of life that we read in memoirs or works of fiction. But again, it's been Zoom for the last 2 years, and we're not sharing, we're not having donuts and coffee. And yeah, I think providing those kinds of spaces are important, and we have to build them. We have to provide that opportunity. I'm so looking forward to us being able to get together again in person. At church, we're still hybrid, and with what's been going on, it makes sense to be careful. But I think at some point we're going to have to venture out a little more, because we can't stay home forever.
Right.
Right.
So just lastly, we talked a little bit about what it was like when you got here, how things have changed in some ways, stayed the same in others. But just lastly, I guess, like, where would you like to see things go from here? What would you envision in terms of forward progress? It sounds like one thing, of course, is just being able to actually break bread together. But any other things that kind of come to mind for you as far as like changes and, where you'd like to see the city go?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think a consistent thing from church, and also from being involved in Respond, is the schools. And I remember the student panel that you did, and the notion of changing up the curriculum, or opening up the curriculum to more perspectives and accurate history. And you know, I'm very, very concerned about what I read and hear about you know, banning books and not wanting to upset children or make them feel bad. So you know, I think there are ways that we could open up curriculum. I don't feel like I personally have a way in to influence curriculum, but you know, I did volunteer for LO Reads and as part of the selection committee. And I think you know, having this last year's book, making that available to the high schools, I think was a good thing. And certainly having associated events that covered history in Oregon, as well as nationally and in Lake Oswego. I think that was important. I can't measure the impact of that, but I think that the more opportunities we provide through the schools or through adult education to see what we've done, you know, and to acknowledge and make amends for that. I think so. I tend to go towards education, reading, discussion, breaking bread, building community. Those are the things that I'm accustomed to, and I think they work. They work slowly, but I do think they are effective in opening up minds and hearts. As far as you know, other changes in the community, you know, I think we're on a path to opening that up, and I'm not close enough to know whether it's going as fast as it can, or you know, what the impediments are. But you know, I think I mentioned before, I think structurally we have a real issue with making or maintaining Lake Oswego as a very exclusive community. And I would like to see us move in a more inclusive direction. You know, housing, I could not afford to live here now. If I was trying to buy a home now, I could not afford to live here. And then I'm on the board of a transitional shelter, and public transportation here is a huge issue, or the lack of it. And you know, coming from New York City, public transportation is the norm. You take the bus or subway everywhere you go, and a lot of families had no car. So you know, to move to a place or to live in a place that is just so not supported by public transportation, it, you know, is another way of not being open to people who don't have transportation for whatever reason, cannot drive or do not have a car. And, you know, I think that's something we should be looking at.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Mhm.
Well, Dawn, thank you again for taking the time, sharing your insights and experiences for this project. Yeah, is there anything again that maybe we didn't talk about that you'd like to share, or expand on, anything else maybe that we've covered so far?
No, I think I'm good.
Okay. Well, yeah, once again, thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, Bruce. It, it helped. It helped me.
I'm glad.